Have you ever thought about how privilege impacts your daily life? Imagine you are competing in a race. You and two competitors start at the same time, but all of a sudden, one is taken out by a boomerang. You keep running, unaware that they have stopped. All of a sudden, your competition is swept to the finish line by a bicycle. You might not have noticed that the first competitor had been stopped, but you certainly noticed when you were passed by your other competitor. That's kind of how privilege functions. Institutions and barriers simultaneously push people forward and hold others back, even if this is not always visible to those being affected. We often talk about the obstacles that hold people back, but we tend to forget that there are advantages that push people forward. Privilege is comprised of inherent advantages that certain groups have over others. Peggy McIntosh describes privilege as an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions that individuals carry with them and are readily available whenever needed. Individuals often have privilege due to their membership in groups, whether that be due to their racial, economic, or social standing. A lot of the privileges that groups experience are actually what most people would want in a just society, like access to housing, a fulfilling education, and respect in social settings. However, not all the advantages that privileged groups have are just. So how do we distinguish between privileges that are in line with our moral values and those that threaten human dignity? There are two kinds of advantages that can contribute to one's privilege: earned and unearned advantages. To have any kind of advantage means to have some sort of skill or condition acquired either by accident of birth or by some means of intention that allows a person or group to lift themselves up and progress farther. For example, veterans have an advantage to board flights early. They receive this privilege because of their status as a veteran, but this advantage does not necessarily harm anyone. It can then be understood that advantages are by definition a type of privilege. However, not all privileges are unjust. The difference between just and unjust privilege has to do with the systematic nature of the advantage. Allison Bailey argues that if we want to determine whether an advantage is a form of privilege, then we need to take a macroscopic view and see whether it plays a role in keeping complex systems of domination in place. If the advantage allows members of privileged groups to avoid the systems of forces and barriers that immobilize oppressed groups, then it is a form of privilege. This is where the distinction between earned and unearned advantages becomes important. We usually understand earning something as having done something to receive it. In other words, there is some sort of reciprocity involved. Thus, earned advantages are ones that we have worked for or have achieved by some merit. Allison Bailey describes earned advantages as strengths which refer to any earned condition, skill, asset, or talent that benefits its possessor and which under restricted conditions helps to advance that person. That being said, unearned advantages are benefits granted because of one's status in a group, whether it be because of race, sexual orientation, or economic status. Thus, it can be argued that all unearned advantages are privileged because of the systematic nature of dominant social groups. However, this does not mean that because it's an unearned advantage that it is unjust. Likewise, not all earned advantages are just forms of privilege. Considering that there are advantages that push people forward, there are also disadvantages that hold people back. Recall the girl that got wiped out by a boomerang in the race. The boomerang and the bike that swept the boy to the finish line represent how advantages and disadvantages work together to keep some groups back and make it easier for other groups to achieve success. Since privilege refers to the strengths received as a product and a contributor to the systems of domination, it follows that disadvantages function in the same way. To better understand whether an earned and unearned advantage is considered just, we should highlight some examples of each. As previously mentioned, the key difference between just and unjust advantages is not the advantage itself, but how the advantage came about and if it played a role in keeping complex systems of domination in place. Take, for instance, the example of a trust fund. Person A receives a trust fund from their parent, Person B. It is an unearned advantage because Person A did not do anything to receive the trust fund, other than being a child to Person B. At first glance, it is unclear whether this is a just or unjust unearned advantage. Now let's say Person B earned this trust fund through hard work as CEO of a company, and started their business through completely moral means. After years of dedication to their company, person B retires and leaves their savings to their child, person A. It is still an unearned advantage to person A as they did nothing to receive it, but is it necessarily unjust? In this case, it can be argued that no, it is not unjust. Person A still has an advantage and privilege over others because their trust fund will make further success more easily attainable. However, this trust fund is a benefit to their life, and the means that it was brought about did not harm anyone's human dignity, making it a just, unearned advantage. It is definitely still a privilege person A has over others, but it does not prevent anyone from achieving a fulfilling human life. Now let's say person B earned the trust fund through immoral means. Person B only made so much money because they exploited their employees. When the trust fund is passed on to person A, it is an unjust, unearned advantage because the dignity of others' lives were harmed in the making of the advantage. The key component in this example is not the trust fund itself, but how the trust fund was brought about. When human dignity was harmed in the making of a trust fund, it became an unjust advantage because it contributed to a system of domination. Now, let's look at an example of earned advantages. Working hard so your family can live in a good neighborhood with a great school system seems to be an earned advantage. However, this advantage can only be earned if one has the means to do so. If person C has a well-paying job and can afford to live in a safe neighborhood, then they have earned the advantage of living there. This earned advantage also appears to be just at a first glance. If person C has the money available, why would they not want to live in a nice neighborhood? However, this becomes more complicated when we take a macroscopic view of the situation. As Allison Bailey points out, redlining often keeps families of color that can afford to live in middle or upper class suburbs from purchasing real estate and moving into those neighborhoods. Now is the earned advantage just? The hard work that person C has done to live in the nice neighborhood is not unjust, but the institutional structure, redlining, prevents marginalized groups from moving into those neighborhoods and thus harms their human dignity. This may not be the fault of person C, but their move into the neighborhood upholds systems of domination that prevents oppressed groups from exercising their full capabilities. Does person C have a responsibility to do something about this? Should they move out of the nice neighborhood in an attempt to detangle the systematic institutions? So now we ask ourselves, why do we care about just and unjust advantages? One of the biggest problems surrounding privilege is that people are unaware that they have it. Peggy McIntosh highlights how our society does not train those with privilege to view themselves as an unfairly advantaged person or as a participant in a damaged culture. We are taught to think of our lives as morally neutral, normative, and average, and also ideal. These advantages are so normalized that when we work to benefit others, this is often just a form of allowing them to be more like us. The importance in differentiating between earned and unearned advantages is that so individuals with privilege can understand how it is not dependent upon the actual advantage, but how these advantages stem from or contribute to complex systems of domination and oppression. Oftentimes, privileged groups will make the argument that their advantages are a product of hard work and that they have justly earned their achievements. While there are definitely instances of just earned advantages, the line often gets blurred between whether an advantage was acquired through moral means. By having a clearer understanding of how unjust advantages play a role into systemic institutional oppression, we are able to ask ourselves which advantages we have a moral responsibility to address. So, once an individual or group has acknowledged that they have privilege, what do they do next? There aren't really any definite answers to this question, and there are many obstacles to fate in the pursuit of eradicating the forms of advantages we talked about. However, the most important thing to recognize is that these are tough questions, and since we don't know what to do, we need to continue to educate ourselves and others around us in order to detangle the complex systems of oppression.